It's official.
Surprised to see this in your feed? Well, if you're a regular on my channel, you shouldn't be. I did make a shitty AMV about my favorite character from this franchise some time ago, and now it's time to talk about the series proper, particularly a speculative piece. This is intended to be an open thought discussion, so please let me know what you think, and if you have any opinions of your own on today's topic, please voice them in the comments. I'd love to get a conversation started. Now, I admit this topic was inspired by another very controversial channel I used to watch until certain things came out about them. And yeah, so another purpose of this is to bring the discussion to a more friendly and safe environment, because I enjoy the topic itself and want to preserve it in some form. All that said, let's get into it. Some backstory before we begin. My Little Pony Friendship is Magic is a cartoon created by Hasbro for the 4th generation of the property. Thus, you'll often hear it referred to as G4, much like Pokemon. The premise is that the series protagonist, Twilight Sparkle, is a nerdy recluse who learns the magic of friendship and studies it under the watchful eye of her mentor, Princess Celestia. Celestia rules the magical land of Equestria as its princess. She controls the cycle of the sun and moon until the return of Nightmare Moon, whom she banished 1,000 years ago according to an old pony's tale, Mare and the Moon. The pilot deals with her return, and Twilight Sparkle's efforts to acquire a set of magical miracle gems called the Elements of Harmony so she can defeat Nightmare Moon and restore peace to Equestria. So, who is Nightmare Moon? Well, by the end of the pilot episodes, she's revealed to be the younger sister of Celestia, who used to rule together as the sun and moon of Equestria. Their cutie marks represent this fact, Celestia's being a sun and Luna's a moon. Now that I've explained all that, let's get into the argument this video is actually about. The question of whether or not Luna, specifically as Nightmare Moon, could have made a better ruler than Celestia had she succeeded in her goals and taken over. The root of this argument comes from the idea that Celestia is wildly incompetent, often passing the responsibility of defeating the major threats to her student and her group of friends in an effort to groom her to one day inherit the role of Equestria's ruler. And when she does try to get involved and help, she tends to be effortlessly swatted aside. This habit of jobbing can be put onto post-Reformation Luna as well, who is often with Celestia when these incidents occur, but not always. There have been times where Luna has wanted to take a more active role, but Celestia expressly prohibits her from doing so, asking her sister to trust in her decision and leave things to Twilight, who more often than not does come through in the face of adversity. However, though Celestia's instincts about Twilight tend to be correct, it doesn't change the fact that in a lot of people's minds, she should take a more active hooves-on approach to handling the threats that come, as they tend to threaten the entirety of Equestria, which would naturally prompt action. But Celestia often takes a pacifist approach, letting her student handle things in an effort to prepare her for the future. It's a fine goal to be sure, but is it becoming of someone who governs an entire kingdom to put her subjects at risk just to teach a few friendship lessons? That seems to be the most often expressed sentiment when it comes to critiques of Celestia as a ruler. In contrast, we don't get to see a lot of what things would have been like under Nightmare Moon. When she re-emerged, she covered the world in eternal night and spent most of her time trying to sabotage the main six. In addition, she comes off like a stereotypical tyrant, boasting about her wickedness, loud evil laughter, the whole nine. But there is a bit of nuance to this. Nightmare Moon is the dark form of Luna brought about as a result of her jealousy towards Celestia, who soaked up all the praise and adoration of their subjects during the day while they slept through her night. This went on for years, presumably, and future episodes of the series that feature the Royal Sisters demonstrates that they often have issues communicating with each other about their problems. It's very likely that Luna perceived Celestia as carrying a chip on her shoulder, and being constantly involved with equestrian politics left little room for them to spend any time together, on top of the fact that they were on completely opposite sleep schedules. All Luna truly had was her thoughts, and it was shown that she was insecure about the other ponies being afraid of her, a fear that was likely fostered as a result of her nightly duties of entering ponies' dreams. She likely saw multiple examples of other ponies being afraid of her, and her sister, being seemingly unconcerned with her issues, only continued to compound on top of whatever other problems they were having problem until she'd finally had enough and decided to do something about it. This accumulated rage and sorrow manifested itself as dark magic that led to the birth of Nightmare Moon and her subsequent banishment to the moon. Now, I said a bit ago there isn't a whole lot out there showcasing Nightmare Moon as Equestria's ruler, but I didn't say there was nothing. In Season 5's finale, The Cutie Remark, Starlight Glimmer modifies an old spell scroll that enables her to travel to the past and stop the Sonic Rain Boom, a significant event that caused the main six to achieve their cutie marks all at the same time. The event that would eventually bring them all together as Equestria's heroes. Doing so leads to a series of alternate realities, wherein the various villains have succeeded in their goals and overrun the world, causing various cataclysms. This sort of proves what Celestia's critics are often saying. Celestia is shown to be incapable of stepping up to defend her kingdom without Twilight and the elements to magic the problem away. In Twilight's own words, each world she comes back to is worse than the last. But let's examine that for a second. World 3 is Nightmare Moon's timeline. The world is cast under eternal night, and while we don't get to see a lot of it, what we do see is interesting. Unlike the worlds we saw before, and the ones we saw after, in which ponies are either at war, run out of their homes, or outright massacred, Nightmare Moon's future is quiet. Other than the Everfree Forest, which is just as dense and riddled with timber wolves as ever, the rest of the world seems okay, at least based on what we see of the area around the castle. A common criticism of Nightmare Moon's ambitions in the early years of the show's run was that her goals and her methods didn't seem to align, which made her come off as incredibly stupid or blinded by her desire for revenge against her sister. If eternal night is cast across the world, all natural life would eventually decay without the sun to cast daylight upon the plants and wildlife. Her goal was to escape from Celestia's shadow and gain the attention and love from their subjects she felt had been stolen. How could she do that if she ended up destroying life in Equestria by not giving it what it needs to survive? However, this episode demonstrated that such ramifications of eternal night simply don't exist. To be clear, the way Starlight's spell works is that she is sent back in time to the day of the Sonic Rain Boom, and after she stops it, she and Twilight, who jumped through the portal after her, would be sent back to the same time and day when the spell was cast. That means each future we see is set at least 5 years after the start of the series. That means that in this world, eternal night has existed for multiple years and hasn't had any sort of negative impact on the environment. This could be due to a number of factors. Maybe Equestria's magical nature compensated in some way for the lack of natural light in the world, or Nightmare Moon had figured out another method to keep life from decaying in her kingdom, which does line up with her overall goal. Once Twilight enters the castle, we also see that the guards and the rest of her subjects display a fierce loyalty to the Princess of the Night. This implies at least a modicum of satisfaction with her reign. No one seems actively afraid or like they're being forced to do what she wants under the threat of death. It could also imply she isn't needlessly cruel, even if these variants of the characters are more aggressive than their usual selves. Based on what little information we get here, Nightmare Moon seems to be doing an exceptional job at keeping the peace, or at the very least, keeping Equestria strong and secure. But things get even crazier when you consider the implications of this timeline. In the timelines the other villains win, there could be a number of explanations for how they got past Nightmare Moon. Maybe she was somehow defeated before their subsequent arcs happened. Without Twilight Sparkle in the main six, Celestia possibly came up with another way to stop her. Unlike all the other villains, Nightmare Moon was the only one she actually had time to prepare for. 1,000 years worth. Either she just didn't escape from the moon, or Celestia could have banished her again or destroyed her somehow. Alicorns are actually much more powerful than the show often leads one to believe, after all. Though this is generally understood by the community, it's easy to make the mistake of assuming they're fodder considering how often they play victim to the current threat because the show has to write around the fact that Twilight is the main character, and she has to be the one to stop them. With that in mind, one can imagine how Nightmare Moon was dealt with, but I personally believe the only way any of the other villains get past her is that they didn't have to deal with her at all. In the hierarchy of powerful beings in Equestria, Alicorns are second to none without a lot of help. Anyway, the point of all that was just to further express what I was saying about Nightmare Moon's timeline. Whatever you think about the power hierarchy hierarchy of this universe, her reign is easily the most impressive compared to all the others. The only time being the opening villain actually worked out to someone's benefit. Nightmare Moon being the first villain in the series means that she has to run through a literal gauntlet of various other villains, all of whom were skilled or powerful enough to defeat or stalemate Princess Celestia. Just so we're clear, she has to go up against Discord, Queen Chrysalis, King Sombra, and Lord Tirek, two of which would end up forming the final group of antagonists that would close out the series. Celestia was, in this episode, shown to 100% of the time fail to hold up to the sequential outpour of threats to Equestria, whereas Nightmare Moon was able to accomplish this with what seems to be little to no permanent damage in the process. She would even, in theory, managed to deal with the seeds Discord planted that were going to overtake the Tree of Harmony and spread across Equestria, without having the elements to sacrifice in order to stop it. In other words, she implicitly demonstrates far more competence in ruling than Celestia herself, especially when you consider that the two worked together to stop all of the other threats, leading up to when Luna transformed into Nightmare Moon. Now, I've talked mostly about ability and power up to this point. One might mistake it for a power scaling video, but no, this is a discussion on the idea of Nightmare Moon versus Celestia as rulers. So far, I've attempted to answer the question of whether or not Nightmare Moon could potentially rule effectively compared to Celestia. What I have not yet answered is, would she? Now, to me, this seems like a no-brainer. The reason Luna transformed was because of years of accumulated, built-up frustration and anger over her seemingly inconsequential status as princess. She was supposed to rule alongside her sister as equals, but found herself often overshadowed both by the literal light her day brings and the general perception of the two by their subjects. This caused her to harness her dark emotions to become a, quote, wicked mare of darkness. Now, while it could be argued she would just be consumed by her desire for power and end up self-destructing as a result of her lofty ambitions, as most tyrants and dictators often do, the fact that Cutie Remark exists shows that there is a world wherein she is able to get past the initial state of cartoon villainy she seems to enter when she first becomes Nightmare Moon, and is able to turn her vast knowledge and power into building the blocks of her kingdom and sustaining her power. Realistically, there's only one way she can do this without causing a revolt and potentially igniting a war like Sombra ends up doing in his timeline, being benevolent. I've tried not to paraphrase a certain YouTuber I've mentioned before was the semi-inspiration for making a video on this topic, but there is a point or two I want to build off. To directly quote, "A content populace will never rebel." In fiction, we tend to look at characters who rule with an iron fist as inherently evil, but as is seen with some characters, sometimes they genuinely want the best outcome and simply feel that seizing control is the best way to do it. On top of that, fiction, and especially fantasy, is filled with kings and queens who are benevolent and always do right by the people, and they do it without surrendering to the widely acclaimed governmental system of democracy. Friendship is Magic itself has multiple examples of this, from Princess Celestia herself to Princess Cadence in Shining Armor, who rule the Crystal Empire after being freed from King Sombra's clutches, as well as the neighboring civilizations who live in relative harmony with not just themselves, but the other kingdoms. Essentially, as long as you keep your subjects happy, they're not going to want to do anything to oppose your rule. Luna may have felt that she was overshadowed, but that doesn't mean she wouldn't see and understand why Celestia's rule worked, and attempt to emulate it in some capacity once she turned into Nightmare Moon and took over. I would argue her attitude when she first turned was the result of all those pent-up emotions having just been boiled over, and being face-to-face with Celestia, who was the source of her despair, probably just motivated her to terminate with extreme prejudice. I'm not going to bring up the potential ramifications of being locked in isolation for 1,000 years, since it is a cartoon, and some liberties have to be taken for the story to work. And since pretty much everyone else who talks about this show tends to criticize this particular element of the relationship between the two sisters. But what I will mention is that despite all these high emotions and her apparent attempts on Celestia's life, in the Nightmare Moon future, she still chooses to banish her instead of kill her outright. This would have to be a conscious decision, since it's always much easier to kill than capture and detain. So she's very clearly capable of making conscious decisions not entirely motivated by her ego ego or her desire for power. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that Nightmare Moon is purely motivated by altruism. It's a power grab born from a deeply rooted desire for recognition. All I am suggesting is that in order to prove that she's deserving of recognition and admiration, she would seek to replicate Celestia's methods to some capacity while mixing them with her own, in order to prove that she's a better ruler than her sister. Celestia is clearly a very passive ruler, choosing not to act until the threat is literally knocking on her door and her back is against the wall. In fact, she doesn't even use her godlike magic to deal with even relatively small things like illness and deformities or anything of the sort. She's very hooves off, and I imagine one of the first things Nightmare Moon would do is get very involved with the lives of her subjects and use her awesome power to improve their lives under her moonlight. I doubt she'd do much for those outside of her nation, but she would definitely take steps to ensure nothing would get through Equestria's borders, and if they did, she'd most certainly deal with them as swiftly and directly as she could. She has the power to do it after all, so why not use it to show off just how incredible and strong she actually is, especially if it's in service of proving herself Celestia's superior. I'm definitely biased because Nightmare Moon is my favorite character in the series, but I just don't subscribe to the idea that she would try to suppress expression and creativity as a means of furthering her agenda of being the end-all be-all of her kingdom, and if she did, I feel like she'd do it in a way similar to someone like Dr. Doom, whom offers stability and peace in a kingdom that flourishes and surpasses all others in pretty much every way you can imagine. Of course, she would try to ensure that she wasn't supplanted and would probably be quick to execute rebels and quell outrage and unrest, but I don't think she's as black and white toxic evil as someone like Chrysalis, who when directly presented with a better way for her people to live, denied it in order to satisfy her ego and security in the idea that her way is the only way. Chrysalis is a hypocrite who only cares about power, and I don't think that's entirely true for Nightmare Moon, despite what Twilight seems to think.
Nightmare Moon would have wanted the Tantibus to turn Equestria into a nightmare!
To summarize, despite the selfish nature of her goals, I feel like it's possible Nightmare Moon would rule with a measure of patience and benevolence, out of spite for her sister, if for no other reason. She isn't an idiot, and the ramifications of Eternal Night clearly don't exist, and she's more than powerful enough to fend off whatever threats may come. I also definitely think she would do what she can to strengthen her nation, even if she wouldn't necessarily subscribe to the ideas of harmony and try to foster peaceful relations with the neighboring kingdoms. It's not unreasonable to think that she would try to keep spirits high and foster a loyal community by using her power to enhance the lives of her subjects. Ultimately, she could be a successful ruler, but would she be better than Celestia? Celestia's strengths come from her ability to foster the hopes and dreams of the ponies around her, building the community up through her peaceful and diplomatic ways, whereas Luna has always been more direct in her approach to situations. It may be barely emphasized in the show, as she's ironically stuck being Celestia's sidekick a lot of the time, but she does express a desire to help in a more direct manner than Celestia often allows, indicating a higher willingness to act, which would directly extend to her methods of ruling as Nightmare Moon. Ultimately, the discussion boils down to the age-old question of peace versus freedom. Even though I don't think Nightmare Moon would entirely restrict the freedoms of her subjects, some liberties would have to be taken to rebuild the nation around her and her particular style of ruling. It's up to you whether or not that's a good thing, and while I'm not suggesting it's entirely positive, I'm just saying she wouldn't follow the path of other tyrants and ultimately sabotage herself in the process of trying to cement her power over others. But to be fair, this is mostly speculation, as we simply don't see enough of her to determine one way or the other. But the little bit we do see paints an intriguing picture, and I don't think we can use Twilight's hearsay, "each world is worse than the last," to assume her kingdom is somehow worse than literal mindless slaves and ravaged warfare, or literally being run out into the wild and hunted by your enemies. I don't really believe in absolute goods or absolute evils, but I certainly don't think a desire for recognition is necessarily a bad thing. The show, in essence, wants us to condemn the actions of Nightmare Moon, but the worst thing she did was attack her sister in rage. That being said, I harbor no malice against Celestia. I think she's a victim of the plot, which winds up making her look a lot less competent than she or Luna actually is. After all, we can use Twilight as an example to demonstrate how strong an alicorn can actually be. After all, she's the least experienced, and I personally don't think she matches either of the Royal Sisters in power until the finale. But that's another topic, and it certainly doesn't help that most of the time the only thing that proves capable of defeating the villains are the magical MacGuffins, the elements of harmony, a power literally no character on their own can match. Would Nightmare Moon make for a better ruler than Celestia?
Probably not.
But it sure is fun to speculate about. I'll even admit, I've made up an AU or two centered around the premise of a theoretical Kingdom of Eternal Night, as I like to call it. But let me know what you think, and if you liked the video and want to see more content like this, be sure to let me know. See you all in the next one.
Outstanding.
I've only done what I thought was best for you. I've given you so many opportunities to find happiness and joy over the years. You wanted so much from life, and I gave it to you when you earned it. Every struggle that has come your way has made you better, and when it didn't, I protected you in any way I could. I saw the potential in you to be great, and I wanted you to have it. I may have provided opportunities, but in the end, you shined by your own actions. It was difficult, but you came out of each struggle braver, smarter, stronger, and a better friend. Every day you made me so proud. I did all of this for you, because I love you.